In the heart of October, with the chill of autumn setting in, my brother Alex and I decided to take one last camping trip before the harshness of winter made it impossible. We chose a secluded spot in the mountains of West Virginia, known more to locals than tourists. It promised solitude, breathtaking fall foliage, and a clear night sky, a perfect setup for horror stories around a campfire, we joked. Alex and I had grown up camping. It was our family's way of bonding. Now in our late 20s, it became a way to reconnect, escaping the hustle of city life. We packed our gear into my truck, double-checked our list, and set off early, hoping to set up camp with daylight to spare. The drive took us through winding mountain roads, each turn revealing a canvas of reds, oranges, and yellows. We arrived at our campsite by noon, a small clearing surrounded by dense woods, with a creek bubbling nearby. It was picturesque, the kind of place you'd see on a postcard. We set up our tents and gathered firewood, falling into the familiar rhythm of camp life. As the sun began to dip below the trees, we started a fire, the flames casting a warm glow against the encroaching darkness. Dinner was simple, just some hot dogs and beans, but out there, it tasted like a feast. With our meal finished and the stars beginning to dot the sky, we settled into our camp chairs, beers in hand. Alex brought out his guitar, a camping tradition, and began to strum some old tunes. The night was peaceful, the only sounds being our voices and the occasional crackle from the fire. It was during a lull in our conversation, a moment of quiet as we both looked up at the vastness of the night sky, that we heard it, a rustling in the bushes nearby. We assumed it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, common enough in these woods and not a cause for alarm. Alex joked about it being a bear, but the laughter died in our throats when the rustling grew louder, more deliberate. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, staggering into the light of our fire. It was a man, disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty. He stopped at the edge of the firelight, just staring at us, saying nothing. The shock of his sudden appearance left us speechless. "Can I help you?" I finally managed, my voice betraying my unease. The man continued to stare for a moment longer before speaking. His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. "Lost my way," he said. "Mind if I warm up a bit?" There was something off about him, but the cold, the way he was dressed, it didn't sit right to turn him away. We nodded, and he approached the fire, extending his hands towards the flames. Alex and I exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between us. We were both uncomfortable, the man's presence an unspoken threat to our peaceful retreat. Yet, the humanitarian in us couldn't justify leaving him out in the cold. As he warmed himself, we tried to engage him in conversation, hoping to ease the tension. His answers were brief, elusive about where he'd come from or how he'd ended up lost. Every so often, he'd stare into the fire, lost in thought, and we'd let the conversation lapse into silence. The night wore on, and the man showed no sign of leaving. Unease turned to concern. Our campsite was remote, the nearest ranger station miles away, and we had no cell service. The situation felt increasingly like a scene from a horror movie, the kind we used to laugh about as kids. It was Alex who broached the subject, offering to lead the man back to the trail in the morning, suggesting he could stay by the fire for the night. The man nodded, seemingly grateful, and we settled into an uneasy truce. The rhythm of our camping trip irrevocably changed. As we prepared to turn in for the night, the man still seated by the dying fire, Alex and I made a plan. We'd take turns keeping watch, neither of us comfortable with the idea of sleeping while our uninvited guest remained awake. We crawled into our tents, the sounds of the night now a backdrop to our vigilance. Little did we know, the true horror of the night was yet to reveal itself, a test of our resolve and a confrontation with the unknown that would leave us questioning the safety of these beloved woods. As the night went deep and the temperature was becoming cooler, the fire only smoldered. Getting first watch was Alex. He had sat down all mute by the tent's flap and turned his eyes across our guest, who seemed to be looking still into the flickering coals of the fire, just like that of an idling car. I finally crumpled back onto my bedroll. The man seemed to eat up every one of these silent moments that had left room for little more than tension, a complete contradiction from the serenity we had come to the mountains to find. After a few hours, my time came to guard. With that, I exchanged with Alex, crawling into the heat of my sleeping bag, disturbed with unease and dozed by the occasional fit and start. I sat there in a blanket, watching the man who now appeared more a shadow than a person, features obscured by the darkness. The night was cold. Even the sounds of the forest were toned down, like the very forest held its breath. A silence of staggering proportions lay over everything. Then, from the stillness, the man said, "You boys ought to leave." His words, unexpected and cryptic, sent a shiver down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to look at me, and in the faint glow of the fire, his eyes seemed to carry a warning. "Not safe here," he murmured before turning back to the fire. His words echoed in my mind, a stark warning that seemed at odds with the man who had seemed more pitiful than threatening when he first appeared. I considered waking Alex, but before I could decide, the man stood up, his movements slow, deliberate. "I'll be going now. Thank you for the fire," he said, before disappearing into the darkness from which he had come. His sudden departure left me stunned, unsure of what had just happened. I woke Alex, and together we stoked the fire back to life, discussing what the man had said. The unease settled over us like a thick fog, the man's warning turning our thoughts to the possibility of unseen dangers lurking in the darkness. We debated leaving then, packing up and driving through the night until we reached the safety of civilization. But exhaustion and the treacherous mountain roads at night held us back. Instead, we decided to stay awake until dawn, taking turns to rest while the other kept watch. The night passed slowly, every sound magnifying our anxiety. But as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the forest seemed to return to normal, the ominous feeling lifting with the darkness. With daylight came the courage to leave our tents and inspect our campsite. Everything was as we had left it, the man's presence the night before almost seeming like a shared hallucination. Yet, the embers of the fire and the additional firewood we had gathered as a deterrent against the cold were undeniable proof of the night's events. We packed up our campsite in silence, the excitement of the trip now overshadowed by the desire to leave the mountains behind. The drive back was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts, processing the night's events. It wasn't until we were back in the safety of our home, surrounded by the familiar and the mundane, that we began to discuss what had happened. The man's warning, though vague, had been enough to instill a deep sense of fear in us. We wondered about his intentions, his sanity, and most of all, what danger he had perceived in those woods. The experience changed our perspective on camping, on the wilderness, and on the thin veneer of safety that civilization provides. We never returned to that campsite, nor did we speak much of that night to others. It remained a shared experience, a reminder of the unknowns that lie just beyond the light of the campfire. Our last camping trip of the season had promised solitude and a break from the world, but instead, it taught us a lesson in caution, in the unpredictability of the human element, and in the mysteries that the wilderness still holds. It was the summer of 2018, a time I remember vividly, not for its warmth or the freedom it brought along, but for the haunting experience that etched itself into my memory. My name's Mike, and back then, I was just another college kid looking to escape the monotonous drone of suburban life with my buddies, Darren, Jess, and I decided to hit the road and spend a weekend camping in a remote part of the Ozarks. None of us were strangers to the outdoors, but this trip was different. We left on a Friday, our car packed with gear, high spirits, and the promise of an adventure. The plan was simple: drive up into the heart of the mountains, find a secluded spot near the river, and just soak in nature for a couple of days. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. We found a perfect spot, an open area surrounded by dense woods, with the river murmuring just a stone's throw away. Setting up camp was a breeze. Darren took the lead, as he always did. The guy was a natural leader, with a knack for making the outdoors feel like home. Jess, on the other hand, was the life of the party, always cracking jokes and keeping the vibe light. As for me, I guess you could say I was the glue. I had a way of balancing Darren's intensity and Jess's levity, making sure everything ran smoothly. The first night was everything you'd want from a camping trip. We had a roaring fire, grilled some steaks, and shared stories under a blanket of stars. It was serene, peaceful, and for a moment, the rest of the world didn't exist. It's a feeling I've chased many times since but never quite recaptured. The next day, we decided to explore the area. The plan was to hike up the river, find a swimming spot, and maybe catch some fish along the way. It was a perfect day for it too, with clear skies and a gentle breeze. The hike was breathtaking, with nature unveiling its beauty with every step we took. We found a secluded pool, fed by a small waterfall, where we spent hours just enjoying the water and each other's company. As the afternoon gave way to evening, we made our way back to camp, tired but content. Darren suggested we go night fishing, an idea that was met with enthusiasm. After dinner, we grabbed our gear and headed to the river. The night was unusually quiet, the only sound being the water's flow and the occasional call of a night bird. It was calming in a way, almost hypnotic. We were about an hour into our fishing when Jess decided to head back to camp, tired and a bit chilly. Darren and I chose to stay a bit longer, hoping to catch something. That's when things took a turn. Darren got a bite, a big one from the looks of it. He fought with the line, excitement in his eyes. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. The line went slack. Darren leaned over to try and see what happened, and in a split second, he lost his balance and fell into the river. I rushed to the edge, expecting Darren to surface, laughing it off. But he didn't. The river, usually clear, was a dark void in the night. I called out, panic edging into my voice, but there was no response. I scrambled along the bank, desperately trying to find him, but it was like he had vanished into thin air. I spent what felt like an eternity searching before running back to camp to get Jess. We spent the rest of the night searching, calling out Darren's name into the emptiness. When dawn broke, and there was still no sign of him, we contacted the authorities. The search lasted for days, but turned up nothing. No sign of Darren, not a trace. It was as if the river had claimed him, swallowed him whole without a second thought. The incident shook us to our core, leaving a void that's never quite been filled. To this day, I'm haunted by that night. The sound of the water, the panic in Jess's voice, the utter helplessness I felt. It's a reminder of nature's unforgiving power and the fragility of life. Darren was more than a friend. He was a brother. His disappearance remains a mystery, a painful chapter that never quite closed. The idea was born out of a need for adventure and a break from the monotony of our day jobs. My friend Sarah and I, both enthusiasts of the great outdoors, decided to tackle the vast expanse of the Nevada desert for a weekend of camping and exploration. Our destination was a remote area known for its breathtaking sandstone formations and ancient petroglyphs, miles away from the nearest town or other signs of civilization. It was the perfect setting for an escape, promising solitude and untouched natural beauty. We arrived late Friday afternoon, with the sun casting long shadows across the desert floor. The sight was more stunning than we'd imagined, with towering rock formations and valleys that seemed to stretch into infinity. We set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by protective rock walls that promised some shelter from the wind. The first evening was everything we'd hoped for, with a spectacular sunset that painted the desert in shades of orange, pink, and red. As darkness enveloped the desert, the temperature dropped significantly. We huddled around our campfire, sharing stories and looking up at a sky filled with more stars than either of us had ever seen. The vastness and the silence of the desert at night were overwhelming. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world. Sometime around midnight, as the fire dwindled to embers, Sarah pointed out a strange light on the horizon. It was a soft, pulsating glow, unlike anything we'd seen before. Our initial thought was that it could be hikers with a lantern, but the light's consistent pulsation seemed unnatural. Our curiosity piqued. We debated whether to investigate or stay put. Ultimately, the lure of the unknown was too strong to resist. We grabbed our flashlights and a GPS device and set off towards the light, making sure to mark our campsite's location. The light seemed to move as we approached, leading us deeper into the desert. The terrain became rougher, and the sense of isolation grew with every step. After what felt like hours, we realized the light was no closer than when we'd started. Worse, we'd lost sight of it entirely. Panic set in as we tried to retrace our steps, but the desert landscape looked different in the dark. Our flashlights seemed feeble against the vast darkness, and the cold was biting. We decided to stop moving, fearing we'd venture further away from camp. The silence of the desert was suffocating, and the temperature continued to drop. We huddled together, waiting for the first light of dawn to find our way back. When morning finally broke, we were disoriented but relieved to see the sun. Using our GPS, we navigated back to our campsite, only to find everything in disarray. Our tents were slashed, and our supplies scattered. The fire pit, cold and dead, was surrounded by a series of strange symbols drawn in the sand, none of which we recognized. The realization that someone, or something, had been there while we were lost was chilling. Exhausted, scared, and with no desire to stay another minute, we packed what was left of our gear and headed back to civilization. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in thought, trying to make sense of the night's events. We reported the incident to the local authorities, but without any evidence or clear idea of what happened, there was little they could do. That trip was the last adventure Sarah and I embarked on together. The experience left us with more questions than answers and a deep-seated unease about the desert's vast, silent expanses. We never found out the source of the light or the meaning of the symbols. Some mysteries, we concluded, are best left unsolved. The desert holds its secrets tightly, and perhaps some places are meant to remain untouched by humans, safeguarded by the unknown forces that watch over them.